On a weekday morning in downtown San Francisco, nothing appeared unusual. Trains rolled into underground stations on schedule. Coffee shops unlocked their doors. Office workers stepped onto sidewalks with laptops slung over their shoulders, moving instinctively toward glass towers they had entered thousands of times before. On Market Street, this rhythm had repeated itself for decades, a reliable loop of workdays, paychecks, and quiet confidence in the idea that downtown America was built to last. One of those buildings was 995 Market Street. For years, it blended seamlessly into the skyline, neither flashy nor forgotten. It was simply there, a working office tower in San Francisco, California, doing what downtown office buildings had always done, housing jobs, anchoring nearby businesses, and reinforcing the belief that real estate in the urban core only moved in one direction. In 2016, that belief was backed by numbers. The building was valued at $62 million, a figure that made sense in a city defined by tech growth, venture capital, and relentless demand for office space. No alarms were raised. No warnings were issued. There were no signs of distress, no boarded-up windows, no sudden exodus. From the outside, stability looked permanent. Then, quietly, the math changed. By 2023, the same building was valued at $6.5 million, a collapse of nearly 90% in just 7 years. The structure still stood. The address hadn't changed. The city around it continued to function. Yet, on paper, one of downtown San Francisco's ordinary pillars had effectively lost almost everything that once made it valuable. There was no single announcement that stopped the day. No moment when commuters collectively realized what had happened. Life on Market Street simply continued, unaware that one of its long-standing assumptions had already fallen apart. How does a downtown skyscraper lose almost all of its value without ever closing its doors? For decades, downtown office towers like this one were not viewed as risky assets. They were considered permanent fixtures of American cities, structures designed to outlast economic cycles, political shifts, and even entire industries. On Market Street, buildings did more than house offices. They anchored confidence. Their presence signaled that a city's economic engine was running, quietly and reliably. This particular tower had stood for nearly half a century, operating through multiple recessions, market corrections, and technological shifts. It survived the dot-com crash. It absorbed the shock of the 2008 financial crisis. Each time, the same assumption held. Downtown office real estate might slow down, but it did not disappear. Physically, the building reflected that belief. Thousands of square feet of office space stacked vertically above one of the most trafficked corridors in San Francisco. It sat within steps of transit lines, retail storefronts, hotels, and government offices. Every workday, it fed a network of activity cleaners, arriving before dawn, elevators cycling endlessly, restaurants timing their lunch, rushes around office schedules. At its peak, the tower supported hundreds of jobs directly and thousands indirectly. Not just employees working behind glass windows, but security staff, maintenance crews, delivery drivers, nearby retailers, and transit systems that depended on predictable commuter patterns. This was not just a building. It was a node in a much larger system. Because of that role, few people ever questioned its future. Office towers like this were assumed to be long-term assets, protected by location, scale, and institutional demand. Companies signed multi-year leases. Investors modeled cash flows decades into the future. City budgets quietly relied on the tax revenue generated by buildings that were expected to remain full. The belief was simple and widely shared. Downtown offices were too important to fail. They had weathered every storm before. There was no reason to think this time would be different. And yet, without a single dramatic event, without visible damage or abandonment, the foundation of that belief began to erode slowly, at first, then all at once. What followed would challenge not just the value of one building, but the assumption that urban stability was guaranteed by scale alone. In San Francisco, downtown office buildings were never isolated structures. They were part of a living Kongdongwon built around predictability. Each weekday followed a familiar rhythm: morning commutes, crowded sidewalks, lunchtime lines, and evening departures that fed an entire local economy. For decades, that rhythm created a sense of own dint that few residents ever questioned. Around Market Street, businesses aligned themselves precisely with office life. Cafes opened before sunrise. Lunch spots timed their staffing to the midday rush. Convenience stores stocked shelves based on commuter traffic, not tourists. These were not speculative bets. They were responses to demand that had proven consistent year after year. Local services depended on that consistency. Public transit budgets assumed steady ridership. City planners expected reliable foot traffic. Even residential decisions were shaped by it. Families purchased homes, signed long-term leases, and enrolled children in nearby schools based on the assumption that Viek Lam Dia Phung anchored downtown would remain available. For many workers, employment in these buildings wasn't temporary. It was a career. Some spent decades inside the same structures, moving between floors rather than companies. That longevity mattered. It allowed people to plan mortgages, healthcare, retirement around an environment that felt permanent. What made this ecosystem resilient was not just the number of jobs, but their predictability. Office schedules created dependable flows of people and money. Even businesses that had no direct connection to the tower relied on its presence. A single occupied building could support dozens of nearby storefronts, each quietly tied to the same source of daily activity. When that activity slowed, it didn't vanish overnight. Instead, it thinned. Fewer commuters, shorter lunch lines, reduced transit usage. The change was subtle enough that many didn't notice it immediately until the gaps became impossible to ignore. The community had been built around a constant that no longer behaved like one, and as that foundation weakened, it exposed how deeply everyday life had been structured around assumptions that no longer held. For the people whose routines revolved around downtown offices, the change didn't arrive as a dramatic rupture. It arrived as uncertainty. One week turned into another without clear direction. Desks remained assigned. Badges still worked, but the future felt increasingly undefined. Some workers had spent 20 or 30 years inside buildings like this one. Their careers had been built floor by floor, promotion by promotion, in an environment that rewarded stability. They were close to retirement, not relocation. Moving to another city, or even another industry, was not a realistic option. What they lost wasn't just income, it was predictability. Others were in a different position. Parents with children in school had structured their lives around office schedules. Healthcare plans were tied to employment. Commutes determined where families lived. Mortgage payments were calculated on the assumption that work would remain steady, not temporary or remote. When offices emptied, those calculations stopped making sense. The ripple reached beyond office workers. Restaurant owners who had built businesses around lunch crowds watched daily traffic fade. Cleaning crews lost overnight contracts. Security shifts were reduced. These were not high-profile layoffs announced in press releases. They were quiet adjustments, fewer hours, smaller paychecks, delayed decisions. What made the situation harder to process was the lack of a clear endpoint. There was no official closure date to prepare for, no countdown. Instead, people waited. Weeks turned into months, as hybrid schedules replaced full occupancy. Offices that once felt busy now felt paused, neither active nor gone. For many, the emotional toll came from the erosion of trust in systems that had always worked. Work had been reliable, cities had been reliable, downtown had been reliable. Suddenly, all three felt conditional. Importantly, this was not about personal failure. The workers affected had done everything right. They had stayed loyal. They had planned responsibly. The ground shifted beneath them anyway. And as those individual stories accumulated quietly, without spectacle, they revealed a larger truth. When office buildings lose their role as anchors, the cost is measured not only in dollars, but in the disappearance of certainty from everyday life. In the years leading up to the collapse, there was little to suggest that anything was wrong. Downtown office buildings were still treated as long-term commitments, not speculative risks. Owners invested millions into maintenance and upgrades. Lobbies were refreshed, systems were modernized. Leasing materials spoke confidently about stability and future demand. At 995 Market Street, the signals were reassuring. Capital improvements continued. Tenants renewed leases. Financial models assumed continuity, not explosive growth, but steady performance over time. From an investor's perspective, this was exactly what a safe asset looked like. What made the eventual collapse feel like a betrayal was the absence of warning. There was no gradual drawdown, no public reassessment, no coordinated transition plan. City leaders, workers, and nearby businesses were operating under the same assumption. Downtown offices might evolve, but they would remain essential. Even as remote work quietly expanded, it was framed as temporary, a short-term adjustment, a pause. Few believed it would fundamentally rewrite the math of office demand. After all, these buildings had survived recessions, tech crashes, and financial crises before. The idea that time itself could work against them felt implausible. Then, almost all at once, the assumptions stopped holding. Leases expired without replacement. Vacancy rose faster than expected. The numbers no longer aligned with prior commitments. The building didn't fail structurally. It failed financially, a much quieter kind of collapse. For those connected to it, the shock wasn't rooted in loss alone, but in disbelief. Everything that was supposed to protect an asset, like this location, investment, history, had been there. And yet, none of it prevented what came next. The question was no longer whether something had gone wrong, but why the safeguards everyone trusted had proven so fragile. The collapse of value at 995 Market Street was not triggered by a single mistake, policy, or moment in time. It was the result of multiple forces converging, each manageable on its own, but devastating when combined. Understanding what happened requires stepping away from headlines and looking at the underlying mechanics. The first shift was structural, not cyclical. Remote work did not simply reduce office attendance, it rewrote expectations. Companies discovered that productivity could continue without full physical presence. Once that realization settled in, demand for traditional office space stopped behaving the way it had for decades. Offices were no longer essential 5 days a week. Many became optional, hybrid, or symbolic. That change immediately affected margins. Office buildings are expensive to operate even when partially empty. Costs, such as maintenance, security, utilities, and property taxes, do not scale down cleanly with occupancy. A building that is 40% full does not cost 40% less to run. In many cases, it costs nearly the same, but generates far less revenue. At the same time, logistics and operational assumptions began to break. Downtown locations had once been prized for access, transit, proximity, density, but when fewer people commuted daily, those advantages lost their premium value. Accessibility mattered less when employees logged in from home. What had been a competitive edge quietly turned into a fixed expense. Another pressure came from supply chain effects that extended beyond the building itself. Office tenants reduced footprints, renegotiated leases, or delayed long-term commitments. Shorter leases increased uncertainty. Financing became more difficult. Lenders reassessed risk models built on assumptions that no longer applied. When refinancing windows closed, valuations adjusted downward sharply. Attempts to repurpose office buildings faced their own barriers. Converting large commercial towers into residential units is neither fast nor cheap. Floor plate design, plumbing layouts, zoning restrictions, and seismic requirements all add complexity. In many cases, the math simply does not work. Even when conversion is technically possible, the capital required can exceed the building's adjusted value. Meanwhile, consumer behavior continued to shift. Downtown retail no longer benefited from predictable foot traffic. Lunch hours shortened, weekday demand flattened. The surrounding ecosystem weakened, reducing the overall appeal of office-centric locations. This feedback loop mattered. Fewer services made offices less attractive, and fewer offices made services unsustainable. None of these factors alone would have erased nearly 90% of a building's value. But together, they formed a new reality. A reality where location was no longer a guarantee, scale was no longer protection, and history was no longer insurance. What failed was not a building, but a model. One built on the assumption that people would always gather in the same places, at the same times, for the same reasons. Once that assumption cracked, the numbers followed. And as uncomfortable as that truth may be, it explains why this collapse was not sudden, but it was inevitable. The collapse of a single downtown office tower does not stay contained within its walls. Its effects move outward quietly, steadily touching systems that most people never associate with commercial real estate. When buildings like this lose value, cities begin to feel the consequences in places far removed from property listings or investor spreadsheets. One of the first impacts appears in city budgets. Downtown office buildings generate substantial tax revenue, not only through property assessments, but through the economic activity they support. When valuations fall, that revenue shrinks. The shortfall does not announce itself immediately, but over time it forces difficult trade-offs: fewer services, delayed infrastructure projects, and strained public resources. Public transportation feels the change next. Systems designed around daily commuter volumes struggle when ridership drops and does not return. Routes are reduced, maintenance schedules stretch, fare increases become more likely. For residents who still rely on transit, the experience becomes less reliable, a subtle but persistent decline in quality of everyday life. Retail follows a similar pattern. With fewer office workers downtown, demand becomes unpredictable. Some businesses adapt by shortening hours or shifting focus. Others close altogether. The loss compounds itself. Empty storefronts discourage foot traffic, and reduced foot traffic makes remaining businesses more vulnerable. The downtown core becomes quieter, not because the city has disappeared, but because fewer reasons remain to be there. These effects reach consumers far beyond city limits. Prices adjust as supply chains adapt to lower density demand. Delays increase as logistics networks lose efficiency. What once depended on concentration now operates across greater distances, with higher costs absorbed gradually by end users. Perhaps the most lasting impact is psychological. Office towers have long symbolized economic health. When they falter, confidence erodes not just among investors, but among residents who measure a city's stability by what they see functioning day to day. A skyline can look unchanged while the systems beneath it weaken. In this way, the collapse of one building becomes part of a larger shift. It reshapes how cities fund themselves, how people move, and how businesses plan. The effects are not dramatic, but they are widespread, felt in routines, budgets, and expectations across everyday life. What happened at 995 Market Street is not an exception. It is part of a pattern quietly unfolding across the country, one that follows the same sequence in city after city. Downtown office buildings that once symbolized permanence are being reassessed, repriced, and in many cases, quietly written down. In Los Angeles, vacancy rates in core business districts have climbed as companies shrink their footprints. In Chicago, towers in the Loop struggle to replace tenants who no longer need centralized offices. In New York, even Midtown has seen buildings trade at fractions of their pre-2020 valuations. On the West Coast, cities like Portland face similar questions about what downtowns are meant to be in a post-office economy. These cases share common traits: long-standing assets, prime locations, no physical damage, and yet, dramatic shifts in value driven by the same forces: remote work, altered demand, financing constraints, and changing expectations about how and where work happens. What makes this pattern difficult to confront is its subtlety. There are no sudden closures, no dramatic demolitions. Buildings remain standing, lights still turn on, but the economic logic that once supported them has weakened. The decline happens on balance sheets first, long before it becomes visible on the street. Importantly, this is not a story about failure in one city or mismanagement in one building. It is a reflection of a broader transition, one that challenges decades of assumptions about density, productivity, and urban growth. Seen together, these cases suggest that the collapse of value at 995 Market Street was not an anomaly. It was an early signal, one example of a shift that is still working its way through America's cities. Today, the building still stands. Its glass reflects the same streets, the same transit lines, the same skyline that once defined downtown confidence. From the outside, there is no obvious sign of collapse. No caution tape, no locked doors, no visible damage. To a passerby, it looks like any other office tower in a major American city. But inside the numbers, everything has changed. Floors that once held full teams now sit partially lit. Elevators run, but less frequently. The hum of daily routine has softened into something intermittent. The building did not disappear. It simply lost its role. What was once foundational became optional, then uncertain, and finally recalculated. This quiet ending is what makes the story difficult to process. There was no dramatic finale, no single decision that closed the door. Instead, value eroded while life continued around it. The city adapted in small ways. People adjusted schedules. Businesses shortened hours. Systems compensated until they couldn't. For decades, stability in American cities was tied to physical presence. Office towers represented commitment, density, and permanence. They were proof that economic activity had a place to gather. When that assumption held, value followed naturally. Now, the connection feels less certain. The building at 995 Market Street did not fail because it was abandoned. It lost value because the world around it no longer needed it in the same way. And that distinction matters. It suggests that the most profound changes are not always visible, they happen quietly, through revised assumptions and altered behavior. As downtowns across the country continue to adjust, one question remains unresolved, not just for this building, but for cities everywhere. If something this central can lose almost all of its value without ever shutting down, what does stability really mean anymore?